Okay, so resuming now our discussion of Rudolf Steiner's book, The Spiritual Hierarchies and the Higher World, or the Physical World. I had to take some time out to prepare all my videos for my Young class, which is coming up on February 13th. For those of you who are interested in Young, it'll be for 9 weeks from February 13th down to April 10th. And I've provided the link on a YouTube promo video that I just did for it. So you would just pull up that promo video, the Young Seminar promo video by John David Ebert. It'll come right up. So back to my studies of Steiner. I have quite a bit of Steiner that I still want to get through. I want to finish the last, we were halfway through. We did 5 lectures in here, and there are 5 more left. So I want to get through the rest of this and then do Steiner's great book, The Fifth Gospel, which gives his very unique and unusual account of the Christ myth. And then I want to go through, I'm going to attempt a very large project and go through his magnum opus, which is the 8 volumes of karmic relationships that he signed off with in the last year of his life, 1924. He died in the spring of 25, but that was pretty much it. That was his magnum opus. And after that, he didn't do anything else that was of that level of significance other than some lectures on the Archangel Michael and the Michaelic Age. So I want to go through those lectures in chronological order, which they are not given in the 8 published volumes by Steiner Books. They're not in chronological order, and I think that they need to be in order to properly understand the karmic relationships, where he discusses the past lives of famous Europeans like Goethe and Nietzsche and people like that. It's always fun to think about people's past lives. So now this chapter. This one's a bitch. I have to confess, there's a reason why I paused with this to go do my Young project. It's kind of a bitch. It's called Geocentricity and Heliocentricity in Cosmic Evolution, April 15th, 1909 in the evening. And what Steiner will do here is give his model of his angelology, which it is very important that he has inherited from tradition, especially from Dionysius the Areopagite's book, Celestial Hierarchies, and that the names and the order of the angels in relation to each other in terms of 3 ascending groups of 3, where the bottommost are the angels, archangels, and archi ascending upward, and the middle group here, powers, mights, and dominions are in the middle, and then the top group is, of course, the thrones, cherubim, and seraphim. The seraphim and cherubim don't figure too much in this discussion because they have to do, the topmost ones, the seraphim, which Steiner calls the spirits of love, have to do with the Empyrean. And the next one down, the cherubim, which Steiner calls the spirits of harmony, have to do with the zodiac. So we're not getting, here we're just dealing with the planets. So to be from the thrones, which are the spirits of will, he names them, all the way down. But it's very important to preserve the order in connection with their traditional order as given in the Ptolemaic model, not the Copernican model. So what will end up happening here is that there are 2 different systems that sort of overlap each other but do not coincide, in which we have the Copernican system, which Steiner refers to as a mythology. It's a contemporary mythology, and it will be seen as such by future generations. It has to do only with the observations of the physical bodies of the planets. But that does not preserve the soul's ascent through the spheres at death, and also, of course, at birth, as it descends down through the spheres in the Ptolemaic order, as it was given in tradition, and then with the Christian tradition, the names of these angels in Dionysius's angelology corresponding to these planetary spheres, not actual planets, but planetary spheres made out of a quintessence, a 5th essence that turns with perfect circular motion. And so the model was that as the soul descends, it first descends from the Empyrean down through the sphere associated with Saturn, where it picks up the qualities of leadership and authority, the Senex, the wise old man, except the grouchy version of the wise old man. Saturn is malevolent. It's a melancholic planet. Depression is picked up from that. Then it descends down through Jupiter, and it picks up Jupiter's the positive king, the benevolent king, and it picks up the powers of wisdom and so forth that goes with that. And then with Mars, it picks up its courage. Then descends down through to the sun, which would have been in the middle there in that system, with 3 planets above and 3 below it, going down to Venus, where it picks up Eros, Mercury where it picks up intellect, and the moon where it picks up its emotions, down to the sublunary realm below the moon, to the Earth at the center of this system, around which these spheres turn, with the planets on them like little bubbles. And then you have all the complicated, with Ptolemy's Almagest, you have all the complicated epicycles and so forth to account for the motions as perceived on the Earth, which don't quite add up. And over the centuries, it was realized it wasn't going to add up, no matter how complicated this Ferris wheel universe, as Arthur Kessler calls it in his book The Sleepwalkers, got. It still didn't quite fit until Copernicus came along and substituted perfect circles for these weird erratic orbits and epicycles and so forth, this Ferris wheel universe, to account for retrograde motion and things like that. He just thought, well, Plato originally said these things were perfect circles. What if we just put perfect circles in? And then a substitution is made. And it's a simple substitution where you just take where the Earth was and where the Sun was, with Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn above it, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon below it, and swap them out. Just swap them out. Now everything revolves around the Sun, and you put the Earth plus Moon in with Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn above it, Venus, Mercury below it, and the Sun rather. So you make that simple substitution, but then this disturbs Steiner's model of the angelology, where he has the angels now specifically associated with the sphere of the moon, and he says that the angelic beings are the beings that have to do with connecting us to memories of our past lives. Most of us are unconscious of our past lives, unless you do things, as I have done, regressive hypnosis. You can remember some past lives, as I have done, or talk to the dead using a medium. They're happy to tell you what your past lives were. But failing that, the angels are the beings that are responsible for connecting you to your past lives. Then in the next sphere of the Ptolemaic model, which would be Mercury, this would be the sphere of the archangels, whose task is associated with the folk spirits of countries and peoples, with groups of peoples and with the different races and so forth. The archangels, who are associated with Mercury, that's their task. Then the next group, the Archi, the group above that, which is associated with Venus and the sphere of Venus, it has to do with the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age that governs the entire species of humanity. What's going on? Let's say a classic example would be, let's take the 12th century. Across the board, around the year 1200, the planet was fascinated with love and sex. And so in India, you got at that time the Krishna literature, the Krishna and the gopis, and you also got their pornographic art on their temples at Khajuraho, Bhubaneswara, and it's all explicit porn, as explicit as our porn is today, except carved in stone. And then you go across the board and you've got the Arabs writing, you've got the Sufis across the board to the west, and you've got the love romances of Tristan and Isolde and the Arthurian romances. And that's a whole zeitgeist going across, even into Japan with Lady Murasaki's Tale of Genji. There's a zeitgeist there where right around the year 1200, the planet, for some reason, becomes intoxicated across the board with love. Steiner doesn't give this example, but it's an example of a planetary zeitgeist that would be under the control of these beings, these archi, whose sphere is Venus. Now, the next group up then are the powers, which is associated with, in the Ptolemaic model, the sun, and they have to do with shepherding the planetary incarnations as the 7 planetary incarnations that Steiner has given us, with Saturn, old Saturn, Sun, old Moon, Earth, and then eventually Jupiter and Venus and Vulcan. This group, the powers, they're known by their traditional name as the Exusii. They are the powers whose task it is to move us along from sphere to sphere. And then above that, there are the mites, also known as the dynamis, who are associated with the sphere of Mars, but he doesn't give what their tasks are. And above them are the dominions, which are associated with Jupiter. And the sphere, he says that they're not so much operative in the planets themselves as the fact that it's in between the orbits, say, of Jupiter and Mars, that the realm of the dominions would operate. In that space between them is where they have operation, just as the angels, let's say, between the sphere of the earth and the moon are in that sphere of operation. That's the sphere of their powers. And then finally, the thrones are associated with Saturn, as Steiner calls them in his cosmogony, the spirits of will. They're associated with Saturn, and then of course above them are the cherubim, which are linked with the zodiac, and the seraphim, which are linked with the empyrean, the outermost realm. So it's very important for Steiner that this model be retained, because he says there are two centers. There's the Copernican system is right as far as it goes. If you're talking about the physical planets, then yes, everything does revolve around the sun. But the fact of the matter is that the Earth is the spiritual center of the solar system. The Earth is where the drama is unfolding and taking place, and where the higher powers associated with this, with the spiritual hierarchies, is interested in. That's where the drama is. That's where the action is. That's where the love and sex and violence are. That's where the good stuff is. That's what's going on. So it's a different center. So then it becomes a way of retrieving the Ptolemaic model by saying that actually there are then these two different centers. We have the physical model, and then we have the spiritual model. And with the Earth at the center of the model in spiritual phase space, not in physical phase space, then we can revive the Ptolemaic model and say that, to save the hierarchies of the angels, and we can say that, but you have to do a trick here, and I think this is unnecessary, but Steiner thinks it's necessary, but it's confusing. And he says that the names of Venus and Mercury were actually swapped somewhere after the Christ event. In that period there, in the Dark Ages, the names of the planets were switched. So that if you switch those names, you can sort of preserve on the spiritual plane, in the separate spiritual system, we can get the order of the planets again. And he's got a little diagram for this that makes it as clear as it's going to get, where we have then with those names swapped. Let's say we have the sun in the Copernican model, and then we would have so Venus and Mercury, but actually Mercury is closest to the sun, and then Venus, Earth plus Moon, then Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. But if we switch the names for Venus and Mercury, and we have the Earth as the center, then we would have the Earth at the center, then with the Moon and the sphere of the angels, of course, then Mercury, as in the original Ptolemaic model, orbiting on the spiritual center around the Earth, not around the sun. Then this preserves the Ptolemaic model, where we have Mercury and therefore the sphere of operation of the archangels. Then we would have Venus, and therefore the sphere of operation of the archi. So the model is not disturbed and the hierarchies are preserved. Then we would have the sun, which is the sphere of preservation of the powers. And then we would go to Mars, which is the sphere of the mites, and then Jupiter for the dominions, and then Saturn for the thrones. And then that model gets preserved. And it looks something like this. I don't know how much of it can be seen here, where the hard lines are the Copernican model, and the dotted lines represent Steiner's, let's say, eccentric, off-centered model, where the spiritual center is the Earth, which is that little dot in the middle, not the big dot in the center, which is the sun, but there's another series of orbits going around the Earth where he has then Moon, then Mercury, then Venus, then Sun, and then up above Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. They don't ever get bothered. So, but that only works if you change the names, because if you don't change the names, then the soul would ascend not as in tradition to the Moon and then to Mercury, but it would go to Venus, which would be the realm of the archi, and then it would go to Mercury, which would be the realm of the archangels. So that would disturb the symmetry of the order. Plus, in the Copernican model, if everything went according to the Copernican model and we had the sun in the center, we'd already be starting with the powers. The powers are associated with the sun, and then Mercury, which would be the sphere of the archangels. Then it would go to Venus, which is the sphere of the archi. Then it would go to Earth plus Moon, which is the sphere of the angels, and see everything gets out of order. As far as the hierarchy goes, where Steiner likes to preserve, he's like Kant in a way. He has very specific architectonic, and he wants it to go in accordance with tradition. So that's the thing about Steiner here, is preserving the spiritual traditions, because he thinks they got it right. As far as the supersensible worlds go, as far as the spiritual worlds go, he thinks they got it right. He does refer to Uranus and Neptune, by the way, in this chapter, but he says that they were discovered later, and there's weird things about them that, in a way, they have nothing really to do with the drama that's going on the Earth. I think there's not an astrologer in existence who would agree with that. Uranus and Neptune play a very vital and essential role in the transits, along with Pluto. In the transits, those are the hardest, toughest transits that you can have. So they do play a role, a very strong one. So Steiner was wrong about this. And in a way, these guys, I just finished a whole course on Carl Jung. It was interesting going back and rereading through Carl Jung, which is the first time I've done it since I was in my 20s. And both of these guys hated each other. They were exact contemporaries. They both hated each other, of course, because they were both alike. And likes repel, of course, as everyone knows about physics. Opposites attract, likes repel. They're too similar to each other in the sense that both of them were intensely anti-modern. Steiner is just as anti-modern as Jung. Both of them had nothing but disdain for modernity. Jung did not understand modern art at all. He makes many comments through his work dismissing modern art, dismissing modernity as a tragedy that has become anti-Christian and fallen away from the traditional values of mythology, Christianity, and the collective unconscious. And Jung spent his time immersed in reading incredibly obscure and arcane esoteric texts, just as Steiner did. His library and the references in his works are full of the most obscure texts I've ever encountered in my life. They are not texts I would even want to read or enjoy reading. This was a guy whose mind just wasn't here, in the here and now. It was in the past, as was Steiner's, almost equally in the past. So these guys are both trying to conserve the past. The same, I think, can also be said about Oswald Spengler, to almost the same degree. All these Germans were anti-moderns, and they all wanted to preserve the past, and they saw modernity's radical departures from the past as a catastrophe for human spirituality. The past matters. It's absolutely fundamental. Like Jung says, consider the Nazis. Who would have thought, you say the past doesn't matter, but who would have thought that the Roman salute, the Sieg Heil salute, which the Romans used, would still be around today, that people would still be worshiping the cult of Wotan today, and a symbol, the swastika, that's as old as the Neolithic, and the medieval hatred of Jews. Who would ever have thought that these things would still be around today? And that's what happens. Those are the kinds of psychic catastrophes that happen when the contemporary consciousness is cut off from its past and forgets. The conscious mind forgets its past, just as the conscious individual, in forgetting the traumas that have been repressed from childhood, will cause you all kinds of problems, neuroses and so forth. And so it's very important to keep our relationship to the past, and especially the West, our relationship to the Western spiritual traditions. Jung makes occasional references to the East. Steiner borrows a lot of Eastern vocabulary, but he completely changes the meaning into Western ideas. When Steiner uses the word Atman, he does not mean the Hindu idea of Atman as a homogeneous white ball of energy that has nothing to do with human personality whatsoever. In the West, the personality matters. The personality is the Jungian self, which is the nucleus and core of the psyche. And Jung consistently makes the mistake of comparing it to the Hindu Atman. He'll say, oh, well, the self is just like the Atman in the Indian system. It absolutely is not. The Atman is totally homogeneous. It has nothing to do with the personality whatsoever. It is simply a splinter of an impersonal cosmic energy, incarnate in a physical body. The self is not that. The self, though it is divine in a certain sense, because it's a different center from the ego, the self is the personality, the uniqueness that you are, and it comes very close to what Steiner means by the ego, not what Jung means by the ego, but what Steiner means by the ego comes very close to what Jung means by the self. This is the transmigrating monad that keeps its personality from lifetime to lifetime, more or less. I have some knowledge of my past lives, and I can see certain similarities in my character and temperament. In certain lives that I've lived, I can see that there is a thread there. There's a continuity. I was a surgeon during World War II in my past life. Before that, I was a Civil War general on the side of the South. Before that, so I can see a pattern where I'm the kind of guy who likes to be in control of shit. This time it was ideas instead of the physical body. Now it's ideas. But anyhow, so I think this catches us up to Steiner. And there is one last point that he makes at the end when he's talking about avatars coming down from these lower three realms, especially the realms of Venus and Mercury, where he calls them children of Mercury and children of Venus, who came down as human avatars during the Lemurian age. They came down, and their outer aspect looked human, but it was actually Maya, an illusion, the outer physical body, and they were actually beings, higher beings, from these spheres of Venus and Mercury, the children of Mercury, the children of Venus, who came down to teach as avatars knowledge of the higher worlds to these people just coming out of Lemuria and entering into the Atlantean phase. So that's sort of where he ends the chapter to prepare it for the next chapter. In a way, the children of Mercury, children of Venus, it reminds me of Doris Lessing's novels. She has a series called The Children of Violence. But the comparison is actually to her Shikasta novels, where she does indeed, and reading Steiner very often, I think this would make a great science fiction novel. For any of you budding science fiction or fantasy writers, you should think about some of Steiner's ideas. And Doris Lessing, basically in her 4 or 5 Shikasta novels, pretty much does the same thing, except that she translates it into the language of science fiction, so that instead of angels and angelic beings from spiritual hierarchies coming down as avatars, she has them as beings from other worlds, science fictional other worlds who have been keeping an eye on the earth, and they're disappointed that it is Shikasta, which means the broken one. This is her version of the myth of the fall. We are the broken ones. And so alien beings will be sent to inhabit human bodies. They're sent on missions to the earth to inhabit human bodies and take up residence to perform certain historical missions. And so her novel spans across the entire history of the creation of the earth and shows you glimpses of the different missions that these beings take on, very much like Steiner's ideas here. So I highly recommend those Doris Lessing novels. The Shikasta is the first one. It's quite spectacularly good. For anyone who likes Rudolf Steiner, I don't know that there was an influence from Steiner, but I do know there was influence from other esoteric traditions, such as Sufism, on Lessing, and the esoteric traditions do have a lot in common, as the perennial philosophy says. Okay, so we'll leave it there with that chapter getting going on Steiner again.